We made this.
Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of the podcast that they call Pick a Disc. I am your host Matt Latham and this is the podcast where people pick a disc for whatever reason they want to and then we talk about it. The disc picker today is Brian Colburn from the Playlist Wars podcast and he's going to be talking about the Boston band The Cars and their 1978 debut album, also called The Cars. And we have a great chat. We talk about how he first discovered music, how he feels this album changed and ushered in a new genre and a new movement of music, the impact that it has, and the fact that this is probably the only time that there's Wikipedia entries for every song on the album. There's just a load of stuff to go from this album, and I quite liked this episode, and you're going to find out how much a bit later on, so I'm looking forward to you to listening to that bit. And before I hit play on the interview with Brian, this is the usual spiel of, if you like us, follow us, blah blah blah. So follow us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, follow us on Twitter, etc, etc. We're under Pick a Disc. And don't forget that we also have the Discord that you can join, as well as just say hello. Just pop in, say hello. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to know that people are listening to this bit of the podcast, as well as perhaps listening to the whole of it. So yeah. So with that done, that's all the admin out the way. I guess the last thing that we need to do now is speak to Brian about The Cars. Okay, just before we start recording, I did say that I wasn't recording the video, but I do have to ask the question of the picture behind you. On the wall, I can see like a guy in a purple shirt. I'm not sure what that is. What is it?
So yes, it's a painting that my buddy had in college, and he had it up in his room, and I always loved it. And when my wife and I got the place, it's just called Jazz Trio. It's a really cool kind of abstract musical painting.
Okay. Yeah, it's like a nice thing. I mean, this is perfect audio. This is perfect stuff for an audio medium, isn't it? But yeah, it's like quite striking behind. Just thought I'd ask a question.
Awesome.
But yeah, we're not here to talk about the art of art. We're talking about another kind of art, the art of music, and an album that you've picked. So, Brian from the Playlist Wars podcast, why don't you tell the lovely listeners the disc that you've picked for us to talk about?
All right. Well, the disc that I picked for this evening is my favorite album of all time, and it's The Cars' self-titled release, The Cars.
I think that pretty much answers the why you've picked it. It's your favorite album. But yeah, so why is it your favorite album? What was it? What is it about it that you wanted to talk about?
Well, to me, this album changed music forever for the better. It blended new wave, power pop, and punk into this kind of unique sound that cemented the band's musical legacy from their debut album. It peaked at number 18 on the US Billboard charts and spawned 3 singles. But the depth of the album goes so much more beyond that, because several of the album's non-singles are classic rock radio staples to this day. And to transcend the single and still receive airplay for an album track speaks volumes to how monumentally important this album is in the grand spectrum of music.
Oh, okay. So how did you come to listen to The Cars, or how did you learn about this album?
Oh, wow. This was one of the first albums I heard all the time when my parents would do Friday night music night. My father would break out his LP collection, and this was the first album we listened to every single week. So much so that there was a skip in the first song on the album. And as I got older and I listened to it on CD or whatever medium I listened to it on, when I don't hear the skip, I almost think it's weird.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say for the skips and stuff, but back in several almost a couple of decades ago, when Kazaa was a thing, and you'd like get MP3s of songs, and what you didn't realise, they were actually ripped from the radio, and there'll be like kind of like you'll just hear bits of like they've tried to chop out the ident of the radio, or like some kind of like local American radio station and nicked it from. So there was like I can't remember what it was, but Linkin Park, One Step Closer. There's always a kind of like WPT3, you're listening, and then but it seemed like to be like the last second of this thing, and it kicked in with that. So before I had the CD, I had that kind of weird voice at the start of it. So it's kind of weird how much that kind of embeds itself.
Yeah, it becomes part of the music, the way you listen to it. Sometimes just if you're a big vinyl person, just that crackle before a song, when you're used to hearing an album growing up on vinyl week in and week out, and the version that you had on your Walkman, I'm aging myself with this topic here already, but when I had my cassette Walkman growing up and I listened to it on my Walkman, it was recorded from the record. So the pops and the clicks of the vinyl were still there. So hearing it for the first time on CD, it really was eye-opening to hear it without those nuances of the analog format. And it's an album that I actually own more copies of than any other album in my collection. I own the original vinyl LP that I talked about earlier. I own the original Made in Japan CD release, which was the first one that they had ever pressed. I own the 2001, they put it out in HD CD, which was supposed to be all the rage. It didn't mean much, but it did become that. And then they put out a legacy edition in 2000. I want to say it was 2007. I might be wrong on the year, but that continues with a second disc of outtakes, demos, and live tracks to really kind of give you a better feel for where the band was in their heads on stage at that point. So it is and actually I own another version. It's the one version that I have a gold CD copy of that was remastered by Steve Hoffman. It's the DCC gold disc version. That's the one that never leaves the house. That's like my Omega Holy Grail CD that will not leave the house.
It's got its own separate insurance policy, just in case.
Oh, of course.
Okay. One thing I want to go back to that I think quite interesting was so the way you discovered it was that you had a family music, like family Friday music listening night, and so I was quite interested. So what happened? So it's just a case that is it your parents would choose an album to listen to, or is it just like we've got these things we just listen to, or is it just a case that we've just bought something new, let's listen to it? Or how did that work?
Usually it just became the fact that I enjoyed it so much, I would always ask growing up, it's Friday night, can we put on some music instead of putting on TV? And they would be like, no problem. My dad would pull out that album. He'd pull out old Black Sabbath, Tom Petty, The Doors, Huey Lewis and the News, Rainbow, just a lot of rock bands. And we would just listen to those albums. Sometimes I would pick songs. Sometimes my mom would pick some, like she would pull out Fleetwood Mac's Rumors. And then my dad would pick something like Huey Lewis and the News Sports. So, and we would just kind of bounce around and listen to different albums. And I would, at the time, 3 years old, dance around, rock out in my, in my living room. And it's something I still like to do with my kids now. I'll just say, what song do you want to hear? And we'll just not turn the TV on and just crank the music up one night.
Oh, wow. Seems like a nice thing. I didn't really have that. Most time that I had when I was growing up was, I think, listening to the cassettes that my mum and dad had when we was driving in the car and stuff. And perhaps one day, Simply Red's Wonderland might be a pick from me because that was played to death. I'm pretty sure the cassette was worn out by my parents at that point. But no, I quite like that idea. So was that kind of your entry into music as well? So did you learn a lot about music because of what your parents' record collection was then, or?
Oh, of course. They were the first DJs in my life. I mean, what they listened to was gospel to me. And then I started learning my own music through listening to albums on the radio, listening to stuff that my friends would dub a cassette copy. Oh, you got to hear this album. And they would dub a couple songs and make mixtapes, and then passing mixtapes around between friends to kind of introduce each other to new bands. But the bands that I listened to in my youngest years, in my childhood, are the ones that I still look back at with just because they helped really shape and form who I am as a music fan. And it really kind of guides the other bands I listen to, because there's so many different nuances in an album like The Cars that has stayed with me. There's new wave, there's pop, there's punk rock, there's classic rock, and there's elements of hard rock in the album, and it covers all the bases. And yeah, definitely.
So yeah, we'll tap into that in a second. For those who are listening and have never heard of the Cars before, the Cars were an American rock band formed in Boston in 1976, emerging from the new wave scene in the late 1970s. The lineup consisted of Elliot Easton, who was on lead guitar, Greg Hawkes on keyboards, Rick Ocasek, is that how you pronounce it?
Ocasek.
Rick Ocasek on rhythm guitar, Benjamin Orr on bass guitar, and David Robertson on drums. Ocasek and Orr split lead vocal duties, and Ocasek served as the band's principal songwriter. Usually don't want to go too much into the actual band's history themselves because it's on the podcast, because mainly it's more about it's the guests' relationship with the album and stuff. But there's a couple of questions I've got with actually the Cars afterwards that I hoping that you can kind of fill in as well, because I know it was only like last minute research and I was dipping into this first bit. So I believe, is it right that a couple of the members formed the New Cars, where they was performing songs from the band later on?
The New Cars was around, I want to say 2006, 2007. And that was Easton Hawks, but they brought Todd Rundgren on lead vocals. And it was a decent sounding album. Believe it or not, Todd Rundgren and Rick Ocasek and the late Benjamin Orr share similar qualities vocally. So it wasn't a far stretch to the point that it sounded like a tribute band or a cover band. But I like the fact that they called it the New Cars and not going under the monkier of the Cars, just based on the fact that at the time Rick Ocasek was still alive. He just wasn't interested in being a part of the Cars at that point. He was putting out his own albums and producing some amazing stuff between the 90s and into 2000, where he produced several Weezer albums, Not a Surf. I can go on and on about a bad religion. He's done so many different monumental rock albums that he's produced. And at the time he was also, doing solo stuff that, I'm trying to think, Billy Corgan from the Smashing Pumpkins co-produced an album with him in the late 90s. So he was busy doing his own thing. And then the New Cars kind of started the discussion, I think, that would lead to 2010 when the band actually did reunite, minus Benjamin Orr, who sadly passed away of pancreatic cancer in 2000. And they did an album called Moves Like This. Didn't quite hold up the magic as the old albums. Benjamin Orr was dearly missed on it, but it is the swan song of the band, and it is, Rick Ocasek's swan song with them now that he has since passed. And it does fall nicely into the catalog, while not a perfect album like the one we're talking about tonight.
In terms of the Cars, I think when you suggested this, I don't think I heard of them at all. I don't know how big or if they got any traction in the UK at all, or if they did, it might have been before I was born, or I was just too young to notice. But yeah, I mean, when the name The Cars just conjures up the Gary Newman song when it comes to new wave. So that's pretty much my history with the band. So I'm just going in completely clean. I've never heard them before. One of the songs that I'll briefly mention as well, apparently quite famous for being in a very famous film. I've never seen that film, so that kind of missed me by as well. So I was coming in completely blank on this one. So this is so this was me learning something. So and I think before we begin as well, and I want to preface this that I quite like the album. In fact, I think this might actually now be my favourite album covered on the podcast. Yeah. This is how much I liked it. Robbie Owens from the Cinemortuary podcast for the last 2 years has pretty much had the title of having my favourite album because he picked Nirvana's In Utero, and for 2 years, which I'll bring back Nirvana in a bit later on. I'll bring back Nirvana because there's an interesting connection to them as well with this album. But so for 2 years, Rob's reign as having my favourite album has probably now been surpassed by this one. And I'll briefly say why is that I think a lot of it, again, as you said, is kind of like a very interesting mix of so many different genres and stuff, and it's a lot of interesting mix of stuff that I quite like, and it feels like it's filling a gap in the history of my music taste, so I can kind of see what influenced my music taste, and there's a lot of similarities to a couple of things that I quite like as well. Whilst it doesn't sound like it, you can kind of see traces of what Phil Oakley would do for the Human League, and I love the Human League, so you can kind of see the basis, and particularly with the 80s new wave, you can kind of hear the introductions of like the synths and stuff in this, and also what I think was a big thing is that I'm quite a big fan of Adamant, and this reminded me so much of what Adamant would bring it. I double checked as well. I think the first Adamant album came out about a year after this, so I would not be surprised if there was some kind of influence on this, or if there was some connection or anything. But yeah, this I absolutely love this. So Brian, you've now just taken the crown of off Rob, who's held it for 2 years. So yeah, thank you ever so much for introducing this album, and I can't wait to dive into it further.
Oh, neither can I. I could talk about this album from now to the end of eternity. It is just a perfect album as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I mean, it's what, 35 minutes, which for the long-term listeners know that I love short albums. There's only 9 tracks on it though, so but none of them break the Latham limit. They don't go on for too long. So I think the longest is about 4.5 minutes, I think. So nothing that goes on too long as well.
I'm going to touch on that a little later on. So
okay.
So this one might actually gray the line for you in terms of long songs, but we'll get to that.
Oh, okay. So I'll be interested to hear from that. But yeah, so I think particularly as well, I think a lot of it as well was that I think being for the late 70s, I think there was kind of saying, I wasn't aware that kind of like new wave influences were coming in at that point. I mean, it's the late 70s. So I usually get a bit hazier when like synth started to come into music and stuff. But yeah, and a lot of things I remember reading about it was saying it's a very important album in terms of, particularly for the new wave, and how it kind of, particularly in terms of production as well. And there's a lot of crossover, I think, in terms of what people perceive it as being a legacy of previous episode, the Low End Theory by Tribe Called Quest, and a lot of people say that kind of influenced a certain sound of hip hop with kind of pioneering techniques or ways they produce stuff. And
oh, definitely. And
I want to dig into you, because you probably know a lot more about this, because a lot of stuff that I read talk about the production of this. And I can't remember the name of the guy who produced it, but apparently a lot of praise.
Roy Thomas Baker.
Yeah.
Who produced several of Queen's early albums all the way up through jazz.
Oh, okay. I did not know that.
So there is that connection of the big anthemic element that he brought to Queen's music. He brought to this fluffy power pop.
Oh, okay.
And really layered it. And I think he's a big reason why the Cars, all the way up through Heartbeat City, he produced all of their albums. They have such a unique and distinct sound, and that's due to Roy Thomas Baker's incredible production work on those.
Wow, okay. I didn't really look into what else he did actually, but yeah. So, and there's a lot of talk about that, and I just noticed he was also producer of the Wayne's World motion picture soundtrack.
Yes,
and I love that film. And the Darkness, One Way Ticket to Hell and Back. Oh, okay, I'm learning stuff here. So yeah, so you say how much did this affect like new wave?
I think it ushered it in. I think it brought it to the masses. The Cars made new wave a household name through their career, and they are one of the pioneers of that sound. There are other bands that could be put into that fold of how ushered into new wave, Talking Heads, some other bands as well. But the Cars really, I feel like, put the pedal to the metal, pun intended, I guess, on bringing that to the masses. And it really helped usher in a whole new class of bands that the labels heard the success that the Cars were bringing, and they tried to make clones, I guess you would say. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. Because like a band that you mentioned before, like a Nirvana, if you remember after Nevermind hit, within a year you had a lot of clone bands that were just cropping up because the label was looking for the next Nirvana. So to be that band that the labels want to emulate moving forward means you've brought something new to the table, and that is the Cars.
I think particularly as well from the 70s, particularly the late 70s sounding of it as well. A lot of the kind of elements I would associate with new wave, like the synth sound, is actually quite subdued and doesn't overpower a lot of the stuff. But I think a lot of the actual music is quite. It doesn't seem to overpower or doesn't seem to be overly loud. And what I mean by loud doesn't seem to be blasting through the sound and stuff. So a lot of the synth solos that you get feel like they're not the main. They feel like, what's what am I trying to say? It doesn't feel like it's the main thing you should be focusing on, but they still stand out. And I just found that quite fascinating. But again, I think that might be because it was the recording of the late 70s rather than how what I'm used to listening to from like modern bands and stuff. But
yeah, definitely.
So yeah, but yeah, there's just like I think again from what I read as well is that apparently I think there was touring and recording. They kind of like to buy just like loads of tech. So they'll just so in the middle of recording or touring they'll get like new pedals or new instruments and they'll just add them on, and it gives and I think that's you can kind of hear that in the album that it doesn't feel like every song has got a similar sound but also feels different in how they arrange stuff as well, and it keeps you interested. ClassicRockReview.com. I can't find the author of the review. Again, based on the produce, just starts with quite simply one of the best produced albums of the era. The 1978 self-titled debut album from The Cars was a unique sounding breakthrough which brought the group instant attention. This was due to the brilliant production by Roy Thomas Baker and the approachable compositions of group leader Rico. How are you beginning to say that again? Is it Asaki? Ocasek, that's it, sorry. This is due to the brilliant production by Roy Thomas Baker and the approachable compositions of group leader Rick Ocasek. Combined, these elements made for a potent mix of new wave cool and radio-friendly pop, which positioned The Cars as an unavoidable duel to carry the day into the late 70s. The band would later jokingly refer to this as their true greatest hits album, as just about all the 9 tracks have received significant rotation on rock radio throughout the years. And I think before we started recording, I mentioned that I made a brief comment saying that I can't think of any other album that we covered on the podcast in which every song has its own Wikipedia entry.
Yep.
This must be a first. I can't think of any other album.
Yeah, and I'll tell you this, when Playlist Wars did our episode on The Cars, I said prior to the taping, I could literally just list this album, track 1 through track 9, as my tracks 1 through 9, and then just pick a 10th song and have a legitimate argument as to why that works, because it is a greatest hits album, even though it is a studio recording of a collection of songs. It could work for a greatest hits album for the band.
You can't. So I mean, again, I don't think the impact of The Cars probably translates as well as in the UK as perhaps in the US. I mean, unless I'm missing something, but I don't know if we have kind of US kind of classic rock radio as you do in the US. But I mean, from what I've read in the past, like there are people that make albums to try and make every song a potential hit. So, for example, I think, forgive me for bringing his name up for certain people, Michael Jackson's Thriller and I think Animal by Def Leppard, I remember reading as being 2 albums where they say, we need to try and make every single song a potential hit. This album feels like they didn't mean to do that, but it has. and
that's because of the strength of those songs.
Yeah. So, and again, I can't think of any other album off the top of my head that has done that. Apart from actual greatest hits albums, and I find that fascinating.
It truly is,
and it's a bit of a shame that they didn't have that. They didn't have that over here in the US and UK as much. So yeah. So which songs jump out to you that you want to talk about?
Let's just start with the first one. It is Rick Ocasek's sarcastic commentary on the state of rock and roll in 1978, Good Times Roll. It's the song that introduced the world to The Cars. Peaked at number 41 on the U.S. Billboard charts, so it wasn't even a top 40 hit, but it is a classic rock staple. All you need are if you were playing Name That Tune, all you needed to hear was do-do-do-do, and you exactly know the song that you're about to hear. It's that iconic of a riff, as simple as it is. And it is just one of those songs that is the thing that makes The Cars music so special. You're taking one part power pop, one part eccentric lyrics that only Rick Ocasek could write, one part of vocal harmonies, but in the terms of singing, 3, 4, and 5 part vocal harmonies, and then you add that punk rock swagger, and you mix it together and you serve it out, and that is Good Times Roll.
Yeah, it's like immediately kicks him in again, and it's it hooks you in. It hooks you in and like leads you with. I can kind of see how it can be radio friendly as well, because it's just got that very. It's got a simple chorus, but it's memorable. Simple chorus, memorable, and the verses again simple, but again memorable, and it just builds up and it kind of introduces you to like that kind of new wave sound, and then just has that kind of like synth riff that comes in, and and it reminds me so much of synth riffs that I've heard in albums for like the last 15 years.
Well, what's beautiful about the synth riffs are Elliot Easton and Greg Hawkes worked together to really layer the guitar and keyboards and make this unique sound. So there's times when you're listening to the album, if you're listening in headphones, you could hear Greg doing something in the right earphone and Elliot doing something in the left, but you could hear they're actually talking to each other in the songs musically. And you could hear the instruments layering what the other side is doing, and it comes together to form this fantastic melody over David Robinson and Benjamin Orr's backdrop of drums and bass. And it really, the way that Roy Thomas Baker took these elements and spread them out across the mix, you could hear every instrument distinctly and clearly, but they all come together so well. You couldn't remove any part of it because it would kill the song. And it's such a big part of that whole album.
Yeah, I think you kind of described it in a way that I was struggling to earlier, in that when you said that it sounds like every instrument is a distance away from each other. So you can pick out every single part. I think that was that. I think you summed up. That's what I was trying to explain earlier in terms of how it doesn't feel like it's overpowering and stuff. And that's probably a good way, because I think it then means that when other songs like later on in the album start to feel like they're closer and slightly louder and come together, it has more of an impact. And it feels like you're kind of there, and you can hear, you're like there in the recording booth, and you can hear pretty much where they are in the recording studio. And
if you close your eyes when you're listening to headphones, you feel like the band is circling you, and that's a beautiful thing to be fully immersed in music that captures that. Because unfortunately, a lot of modern music, some of the mixing has gotten pretty one-dimensional, where everything's right down the middle, and there's not a lot of panning and a lot of playing with stereo separation, and you lose that because it's just an assault on the ears, and it sometimes detracts from amazing songs. And the production they did here is truly that experience where you could be like, I'm just going to listen to the bass line, and you can just kind of focus in on what he's doing, and you can hear how much it adds to the song. And that's on every song on this album.
So it is a slight detour for a second. So I'm assuming that's linked to this concept of the loudness war then. So when people start talking about the loudness war, is that what you're talking about, when like instruments start to try and get louder and compressed that you can't really tell what's playing? Or is that...
Well, that's in the mastering stage. When they master an album, a lot of these songs don't sound like that before they get to mastering. The loudness wars has unfortunately been brought on by the fact that people used earpods and very crappy earbuds when iPods first came out, and they noticed that when they were listening to older music, they'd have to turn the volume up, and then newer music, they'd have to turn it down. But when that was the case, those newer songs grabbed your attention. Oh, they're so much louder. And people started to think that louder meant better. And there are elements of the Cars album that are not loud at all. For example, I'm in Touch with Your World is a very downtrodden, mellow song. And if you listen to that with headphones, there's so many sound effects and different instruments that the song actually veers off into a weird category. And this is one that it was a B-side for one of the other singles on the album. And it really just showed the creativity behind, because they created this sonic story that's being told through these sound effects and these haunting, creepy lyrics. And then it's butted up to a kind of a raging punk song in Don't You Stop. And the quiet to manic flow that you're getting from that album, I'm in Touch with Your World, brings you down from a trio of hit singles. And it really goes off into this weird place. And if it was as loud as every other hit single, you would lose that flow of the album. And that's where the Loudness Wars kills it, because every element is the same volume. So there's elements in I'm in Touch with Your World, which wasn't even one of the songs I planned on talking about, but where if you listen very carefully, there's little quiet things happening in the background that are so cool and so subtle. And once you hear it, you can't picture not hearing it in the song. And that's kind of the beauty of that production.
Yeah, okay. The production side of music is something that, as I keep saying, it's not one of my strong points in terms of listening to stuff. And I feel like one of the main things about the podcast is learning stuff. So it's nice to have like an example of like against the concept that I've been reading about and don't fully understand, even though I've been editing a podcast for nearly 2.5 years and I should know what compression means by now. But yeah, I mean, talking about I'm in Touch with Your World, actually that's the song that reminds me so much of Adamant.
I could definitely hear that. Yes. The first one that I was familiar with was Friend or Foe, which was, even though Kings of the Wild Frontier came out in 1980, I was only 3 years old at that point. So it wasn't until I started hearing tracks from Friend or Foe on the radio as I was getting older that I discovered who Adamant was.
Okay. But yeah, I think those particularly, those, and Kings of the Wild Frontier, that like Doggy Dog and Ant Music, that kind of lo-fi. It's like almost garage rock, but a decade beforehand. I don't want to say low quality. That seems it's not low quality. It's that quietest production you was talking about. It just reminded me so much of that, and I think that's what kind of drew me to it. So yeah. So after inadvertently talking about that song, which song do you want to talk about next?
All right, the next one I'm going to talk about is kind of the start of the argument that I actually think you like a long song now.
Okay.
I know how you hate them, but hear me out. I have this CD ripped to my phone because if I'm ever just in the car and I'm like, I'm in the mood to listen to it, I can just, pull it up and play it. But it's only 7 tracks on my phone.
Okay.
And that is because I took the 3 tracks, Bye Bye Love, Moving in Stereo, and All Mixed Up, and sequenced them as one file on my phone because those songs are woven together musically on the album. And if you listen to them, it is actually an 11-minute suite of songs, not 3 singles, although some classic rock radios will pick out 1 or 2 of the songs and play them. But a lot of classic rock stations in the US actually play the trio of songs as a single suite on the air. And the songs, like, to me, so when I hear Bye Bye Love, I expect to hear the ending saxophone for All Mixed Up at the end of that song. But that's just me. The song I picked out of my favorite of that trio is track 7, Bye Bye Love, because You're All I've Got Tonight is this thunderous power rock song. And from there, it screeches to a halt and Bye Bye Love kicks the album's coda in, but it's this perfect power pop song. It's got angst. Benjamin Orr has a funky bass line that is layered with heavy chugging guitars from Elliot Easton. Those two shouldn't play well together. They do. And then the stuff that Greg Hawkes is doing down the center of the song bring this pop element to it. So you're kind of mixing funk and punk and pop all together. And lyrically, it's my favorite lyrics on the album. My favorite line, they actually had a tribute compilation named after this line. I just love it so much. Substitution, mass confusion, clouds inside your head. And he uses it in both the second and third verse. And in the third verse, it's kind of a growing intensity. But this song is just so much fun. It's everything about the power pop side of the Cars. And it is the song that truly sums up the band's entire career from that album. Because if you listen to the other albums, they do veer much more into pop, especially Heartbeat City, where it was the first album they did without Roy Thomas Baker producing it. And that album went all in on the pop. And everyone's like, this is new. This sounds different. And my father would say to them, just go back and listen to Bye Bye Love. It was always there. They just added a little bit of a spit, shine, and polish on it on the Heartbeat City album. And this song is the second one that I would definitely love to highlight from this album.
Yeah, I think it's one of the ones that caught me as well. And I think it's probably because it's one that I feel kind of is like an influence to like other bands that I love. So one of my favourite albums of all time is Hot Fuss by The Killers, which is I think The Killers restraining their Bruce Springsteen influence which will come in on Sam's Town, which again is like my second favourite album of all time. So this feels, I could picture this being a Killers track in the Hot Fuss era, and again it's just that kind of like mixture of rock, kind of indie rock, and that new wave kind of synth sounds, and that kind of sing-along chorus of Bye Bye Love. I just got a picture of Brandon Flowers singing it. In fact, I'm pretty sure part of me just tempted to see whether they've actually covered either this or The Cars, because I'll be surprised if they haven't.
I was just going to say, if you look up on YouTube, there's a fantastic cover of The Killers doing My Best Friend's Girl from this album. Sadly, not Bye Bye Love, but I would much rather hear them do Bye Bye Love. I love My Best Friend's Girl. Don't get me wrong. My band covers My Best Friend's Girl. It's such a fun song. I love it to death. But Bye Bye Love is just even stronger than that. And My Best Friend's Girl was the second highest charting song from that album. It peaked at number 35. So it was a top 40 hit for the band. But Bye Bye Love, a deep album track that still continues to get airplay, was not a single.
Wow. Okay. And Bye Bye Love is part of this trio of songs that you claim is one song, but I think, again, part of me, I think that I still think the three songs. I'm going to defend my. I'm going to defend my anti-long song bias. There's only a few times.
Defend your honor. Defend your honor.
There's only a few times where like there's only a couple of songs beyond 6 minutes that get my attention. But I mean, but then again, like songs bleeding into each other in terms of an album sequencing, I always think that's fine. That's quite interesting. When Babs from Over Underrated was on in February with the Auto Lux album, the last 5 or 6 songs pretty much merged into kind of a singular kind of sound, but were separate. I mean, like, you can make the argument that Bohemian Rhapsody is about 4 2-minute songs mixed together. But then again, you can't hear. Then again, Bohemian Rhapsody doesn't work when it's separate. I still think they're 3 different songs, but
that's why I went with the word sweet, because it does feel like, and that's something that I loved about 70s albums. The songs were separate pieces of art, but the way the production merged them together, you could listen to it in 1 or 2 ways and get different experiences either time. And I think that's just brilliant for the album heads versus the single heads.
Yeah, and I don't know whether you was going to talk about stuff, but I do want to talk about My Best Friend's Girl briefly. I don't know if that was one of the ones you wanted to talk about, but firstly, in a nice kind of, as I alluded to earlier, and I find it quite interesting that you said that the Killers covered it as well. Apparently, because there's video footage on YouTube of Nirvana's last ever gig in Munich, and they cover this. So, and for the fact that this has now taken In Utero's place as my favourite thing on that. There's a strange passing of the torch, but yeah, Kurt and stuff.
Kurt Cobain was giving his forward-looking approval for you picking the Cars over it way back when at their last gig. Yeah,
so I know that Kurt Cobain will probably approve of the Cars going up on that. But My Best Friend's Girl, I think kind of does pop punk 20 years before pop punk becomes a thing, because this feels like an Adam Schlesinger song. This feels like, rest in peace, Mr. Schlesinger. This feels like that something he would have written, and again,
that's why I'm such a Fountains of Wayne fan. They feel so much. Stacy's Mom to me feels like an ode to the Cars. You would not have Stacy's Mom if you did not have Just What I Needed.
It might be the introduction to My Best Friend's Girl, which sounds exactly like the start of Stacy's Mom. Where it kind of like has that riff, but it cuts off. It feels like it's a distorted guitar, but they actually cut off the distorted sound just before it does that. Yeah, but again, this feels like, I don't say ahead of its time, but it might be. I think again, if the elements were louder, and I think if Rick Ocasek had a bit more of a whine to his voice, it could theoretically be a Blink-182 song as well. It's just got that kind of pop punk element to it, and I was like, I listened to it, I'm like, I thought it sounded like a song from 1999 at the time, but it was written 20 years earlier, and it just kind of flips in. And the fact, again, and I've listened to other podcasts that talk about Kurt Cobain kind of like liking kind of like that kind of almost poppy element to stuff, kind of like poppier bands or bands that have that pop element stuff. It doesn't surprise me, actually, that listen to this, that he'd choose to cover the song. So yeah, and it's just got the chorus as well. It's probably my favourite song off the album, actually. I really enjoyed it.
It was this one, I think I mentioned earlier, it was 2 of the top 40 hits that came from this album. This one peaked at 35, and the one that was the highest was Just What I Needed, which peaked at 27. So the first 3 songs on the album, if you forget the fact that Good Times Roll peaked at 41, are as close to 3 top 40 hits to start an album off. And that's where you get that almost perfect album side, almost in the realm of Boston's self-titled album, which is kind of funny because the Cars are also from Boston, Massachusetts. But Boston's self-titled album, you have More Than a Feeling, Peace of Mind, and Foreplay Long Time. 3 massive hits, and then hell, the rest of Boston self-titled is full of hits too, but the Cars had all these hits at the front of the album. And then you had a bunch of other tracks that were not hits, however, are still played on classic rock to this day. And the one that I mentioned earlier, You're All I've Got Tonight, which starts off side 2, track 6 on the album, that's the third one I want to highlight because this is a hard rock heavy song. David Robinson's drums that is just pulsating, those toms, they drowned it in flange. So it's soaring up and down. So it's almost computerizing these drums that are basically a hard rock song. So it's taking this hard rock sound that you would expect to hear with a Led Zeppelin or a Sabbath, and then it's flanging it, giving it this pop feel and this spit shine back in 1978 that this song is primal for the band. And this song speaks to hard rock fans. And in 1996, I mentioned earlier, Billy Corgan helped produce Rick Ocasek's Troublizing album. But the Pumpkins also covered You're All I've Got Tonight as the B-side to their Bullet with Butterfly's Wings single. So that actually gained some light college radio airplay in the United States based on the fact that it was a cover of the Cars song. But as far as I was concerned, that cemented the band's legacy even more because here was a band in the 90s that I dug that was paying tribute to this album that I grew up with as a kid. And it still shows how much these songs resonate with people. Even now, God, we're almost 40-something years old, this album. And it still, in some ways, feels modern and fresh. And that's very, very hard to do.
Yeah, I think You've All I Got Tonight as well, I feel is kind of like the centerpiece of the album that it builds to and kind of releases. So I think it feels bad to say the best albums have that kind of like a mounting feel to them where you kind of get to a point and you kind of like wind down. But this album does have that. And I mean, other albums that don't do that, perfectly fine as well, but You've All I Got Tonight kind of feels like it's the peak of like the energy and it kind of builds stuff. So when I mentioned earlier during Just What I Needed, I think where you feel like the bands are all separate, this is the one where it feels like it's all coming together and they're all getting loud and all these elements are kind of clashing, and it doesn't have that garage rock kind of nice to listen to clashing. It's all very kind of polished and in melody, but it just feels like all the elements that the band has all combine on this album. So all these different sounds and instruments that you've heard in different pieces throughout. If it was a Broadway show, it'd be the signature song. It's the Defying Gravity of the Cars. It's the my knowledge of musicals is really crap, so I can't think of any other signature songs from musicals. But I know what you mean. Like when you think of any musicals and it's like the first song that jumps out, this feels like it's the Cars' attempt at a signature song. It's not my biggest hit, but it feels like it's the centerpiece of the album where all the elements combine together, and it's a nice payoff from all the different things that was happening beforehand. And it's just, again, it's the importance of the sequencing of an album in terms of that. You've got all these things that happen together and it all comes together in this one. So,
definitely, I definitely agree with that. It's one of those songs that, again, I'm in touch with your world. Don't you stop. And then that ends side 1. If you're listening to it on an album, then you flip it over and there's this song, which almost makes you go, am I listening to the same album? Because it really comes from out of left field, but the way it's produced, it still feels a part of the band's voice. The vocal harmonies in that song are soaring over this song that you would almost expect screaming. It just feels like it's just heavier and more aggressive and more just anger. But it's not really an angry song, but the vibe of it is. But the slick production and the vocal harmonies give it that pop feel. So you're always teetering on this kind of seesaw of sounds. And because of the way it was brilliantly produced, it still fits in the narrative of the album while standing out as a single on its own, which is why it gained classic rock radio airplay in the US, even though it was a B-side. Because it grabbed your attention and it grabbed the DJ's attention. So the song became popular from DJs loving it. The radio was not getting pushed this song. It got pushed by the DJs who championed this song. And that's why, again, this album's got several of those tracks. And how often do you hear about a new album that comes out from a modern artist where radio's not playing the single released to the station, but rather a deep cut or something that you normally don't hear? The last time I remember that, in the US at least, was a 1-2 punch from Pearl Jam, where Yellow Ledbetter got a lot of radio airplay, which was a B-side to one of the Jeremy single, and Last Kiss, which was a cover song that they did for the fan club that ended up getting radio airplay. And I can't recall any songs after that where this kind of phenomenon where DJs kind of organically grew a song that wasn't a hit. It obviously happens on the internet, on YouTube, because people gravitate to the songs they do. But on radio, where the money is behind it, the advertising's behind it, it's very rare to have something like that happen. And for the Cars to do that just shows the strength of those songs.
Okay, because I think the US is, from what I believe and from what I gathered from the podcast Hit Parade by Chris Melanthi, in that there's a difference between the UK and the US charts, where I think radio airplay has an impact on the actual charts, and there's a couple of them that I sometimes get confused about what does what, whereas in the UK it's mainly to do with record sales. And talking with all that phenomenon about different radio play, the only thing I can think of, the example I can think of that is quite recent, but that's because of, I think, several years ago, they changed the metric for the UK to include streaming. And so you do start to have like album songs or weird songs suddenly appear back into the charts because of streaming.
That when Rage Against the Machine exploded back onto the charts in the UK?
That was in 2009. So that was just before like streaming. That was people buying it off iTunes, including me. So video downloads was one thing, but this was streaming. So we got to a point in like 2007, 2008, where Ed Sheeran had 9 songs in the top 10 because people were streaming his latest album and the radio had to go and playing those tracks because like the chart show would play every song on top 40 in the lead up to stuff. So there was a podcast called Unbreak My Chart which was covering this, and like you had 2 hosts who didn't like Ed Sheeran having to talk about Ed Sheeran, there was I think they changed the rules after that, so that wouldn't happen. I think it's like the top 3 songs from a single album are only allowed in the top 40 now, I think. Don't quote me on that, but they did change it to try and stop that happening, so you don't have that. But that's the only equivalent I can think of that happening. But again, that is down to a different kind of model, different streaming. That's not a DJ particularly saying, oh, clicking on that, because I think in the UK, a DJ could like play the most randomest song off an album, no one buy it, and it won't go into the charts because radio play doesn't have an impact in the charts, whereas on your side of the pond it still does. So which is probably why it started getting picked up and picked up by a lot more people. So so it's kind of weird how the music system works over there. So I think that's how I don't think that's probably why the Cars never really had that here, is because either DJs just weren't playing it or people just wasn't buying, I think, singles can't chart. So singles can't chart. So, apart from now when you can buy streaming. So So those are the three that you wanted to really talk about. So is there any other song that you want to briefly mention before we move on?
Honestly, I would love to just mention the closing track, All Mixed Up. Now, I know you were going to talk about a scene in a movie, so I know you have one other song, so I'll hold that talk for that song. But All Mixed Up, Greg Hawkes closes the album with a saxophone solo. How often do you put together new wave music and saxophones? It shouldn't on paper work, and it does. And it's a beautiful solo. It's very soaring, and it's not fast. It's not your Bruce Springsteen type saxophone solo. It's just kind of these notes that just linger, and they kind of just weave into the music that's happening as the vocals are just getting layered on and layered on. And it's kind of this mountain that they're building at the end of the song, kind of this massive crescendo. And that's why when I talk about those three songs as a whole, I just feel like it really tells such a great story between the three songs. Because you have Bye Bye Love, which is the power pop. You have Moving in Stereo, which goes kind of along the lines of I'm in Touch with Your World. It goes into the weird. Probably the best mixed song on the album. And obviously it's in people's it's in people's dictionary because of the movie reference that I know you're going to make about it. But All Mixed Up kind of goes in this different direction and closes with a sweet sounding, I don't want to call it a ballad, but it's different and it works, and it shouldn't, but it does.
The song actually I'm talking about was Moving in Stereo, which is from a film I've not watched, but...
Not for the kids. Fast Times at Ridgemount High.
Yeah, Ridgemount High. And it's an infamous scene where I think it's Phoebe Cates and Judge Reinhold character removing her top while embracing him. Although the song was popularised in the movie, it never included on the soundtrack album, which was...
No. But there are so many people, when they hear that song, you could tell they close their eyes and they're like, Phoebe Cates. Because that is just ingrained in people's minds, to the point that on Playlist Wars, I made a joke when someone brought up the movie. I said, there's a song playing during that scene, because, it's just one of those very pop culture moments in U.S. movies, in U.S. film. And that song is now immortalized twice over for being a part of such a monumentally game-changing music album, as well as the backdrop for Phoebe Cates. And both are particularly strong arguments you can make for both of those.
So moving on to the reception of the album. Critically, the album was well received. Commercial, I don't know, I couldn't find much about its commercial success.
I got a couple of things on that if you want.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, the album is currently 6 times platinum in the U.S. And Rolling Stone magazine in 2020, it made number 353 in their top 500 albums of all time. Sadly and wrongly, it slipped from number 284 in 2012 and number 282 in their 2003 edition. So for the last nearly 20 years, every time they put out a top 500 albums of all time, The Cars is on there. The fact that it slips, again, it's all subjective opinions, and this is the opinions of the Rolling Stone magazine staff and whatever research they do. This album, honestly, for me, should be in the top 20 of albums of all time, just because of the era of music it ushered in. It's as monumental as a Nirvana's Nevermind. It's as monumental as a Beatles album coming to the US and changing the landscape of music in a different way. There's not a lot of bands that could really say that they painted a off-ramp on what was mainstream and took you into a new genre and into a new area. And the Cars did that. And I feel like number 353 out of 500 almost pounces on the significance of that. And I think it should be much more recognized. I'm getting off my soapbox about that.
Yeah. But I think quite a few of the critiques of it were pop, like basically praising it across the board. Kit Rakalis, a critic called Kit from Rolling Stone said the pop songs are wonderful, easy and eccentric at the same time, all are potential hits. He found that the album comes apart only when it becomes arty and falls prey to producer Roy Thomas Baker's lacquered sound and group's penchant for electronic effects, which I don't think is actually a negative. And I think when you was on about subjective opinion, I think that kind of adds to it. Robert, people be surnames I can't pronounce. The Village Voice staff member, Robert Kreisgau, the Village Voice. If they ever listen to this, I apologise. Rick Ocasek writes catchy, hard-headed to cold-hearted songs. Rick Ocasek writes catchy, hard-headed to cold-hearted songs, eased by Riley rhapsodic touches. The playing is tight and tough, and it all sounds so wonderful on the radio. All Music's Greg Pratzo praised the Cars as a genuine rock masterpiece and stated that all 9 tracks are new wave rock classics, concluding with flawless performances, songwriting and production. The Cars debut remains one of rock's all-time classes. You're not secretly him, are you? Because that just seems like... I'm pretty sure you said the exact same thing earlier.
Yeah. No,
yeah.
I'm not.
Yeah, and I think as well, there's a quote from Elliot Easton, and he said that we used to joke that the first album should be called The Cars' Greatest Hits. We knew that a lot of great bands fall through the cracks, but we were getting enough feedback from people respected to know that we were on the right track. Yeah, so it was well received. I think some of the more subjective critiques, I think, is more subjective stuff. So, because I think, again, the Rolling Stone review from 1987 I mentioned earlier, I think the electronic effects aid it, and it makes it a lot more interesting, particularly I think at the time where it's probably something that was quite rare or it was more experimental than you actually heard at the time. So so that's the reception of the album. I did find that I think it was 6 million, as you said, 6 times platinum in the US. It's still certified silver in the UK, but again, as shown in other episodes, the getting certification in the UK is a lot easier than the US because there's a lot less few of us to spend that much. So it's only 60,000 sold in the UK. So yeah, we've come 2 times platinum in Canada. So, but apparently it reached 29 in the UK albums. So yeah, and 18 in the US Billboard charts. Oh. So yeah, so that was the Cars. So have you ever seen them live?
Sadly, no. They came around in 2011 on the Moves Like This tour, and I missed on getting tickets, and I said I'll catch them the next time around, and sadly, there was never a next time around. With that being said, I hope with Rick Ocasek's passing that Elliot Easton, Greg Hawkes, and Dave Robinson maybe consider doing a revival of the new Cars again with Todd Rundgren to celebrate the band's legacy one more time, do one last lap around and celebrate all that Rick and Ben brought to this band and to the music, especially because they were just put into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame before Rick passed. So to be able to celebrate that one more time, even with Todd on vocals, I'd be knocking down the door at this point.
So, other albums in the Cars discography, where would you recommend people who are just perhaps listening to this album, where would you recommend they go next for the Cars? I.e. me, because I've pretty much made a playlist already with all the albums on, so where would you recommend me going next?
I think you need to go right on to Candio, which is their 1979 album. That, to me, is a continuation of the Cars. They're still in that punky, new wave, power pop fusion, and it is the second strongest album after the self-titled. Then, believe it or not, their fluffiest album is going to be the one I recommend right after that, 1984's Heartbeat City. It's got a much more of a spit shine on it, whereas Panorama was much darker, and Shake It Up leaned towards where they were going towards for Heartbeat City, but Heartbeat City mastered it. And it was the last great album from the band, because Door to Door, the band was already infighting with Ben and Rick having separate solo albums, and it feels like a conglomeration of tracks that are of people that don't like each other. It feels like solo songs from Rick, solo songs from Ben slapped under the Cars label. Some good tracks on it, some that do definitely hold up, but none that would really jump out at me or make my top 10 if kind of a spoiler alert for the Playlist Wars episode. And then Moves Like This in 2011 is much more of a nice little looking back end cap. Never quite meets the greatness of the original albums, but it's nice to have it now, especially because there will be no more music from Rick. So I look at it with a bit more of a fondness because the album ended on a happier note, whereas Door to Door, kind of the band just fell apart after that. So it's kind of a nice coda on the end, while it doesn't hold up to the other albums I mentioned before.
Okay, yeah, definitely going to be checking them out because, again, this is I feel like I feel like this is one that I could be listening to when I should be listening to future episodes. That's how much I really like this. So I definitely want to check out the rest of the Cars discography. And with that, as we're gearing up to the end of our conversation, Brian, this is the most important part, which is the song for the playlist. Now, for people who haven't listened to the podcast before, what this is a Spotify playlist called the Hall of Fame, where I'll ask Brian to pick one song from this album to be immortalised forever. And I can't veto it, so whatever Brian says goes. Brian, which song are you going to put onto the playlist?
We're going to go away from the hits with this one, and I'm going to go with track 7, Bye Bye Love.
Bye Bye Love. And for the reasons we've said before, yeah. So it's no, I mean, again, it's one of these albums where pretty much potentially all of the tracks could come on to. By
all means, and the reason I picked that one is I told you the other albums you should listen to next. Bye Bye Love. You could feel that song on those other albums. You could feel that vibe. You could feel that that's where they continued down that path. And this is the one song from the album that I'm still shocked was never a single.
Oh, okay. And again, now with that, this is definitely the end now. And Brian, I just want to say thank you ever so much for coming onto the podcast and for dethroning Rob and his In Utero. And In Utero.
I will give Rob a lot of credit though. In Utero's a hell of an album. I can understand why you love it so much. So
yeah, again, that was for similar reasons. I think that I ended liking this because In Utero feels pretty much like In Utero is like pretty much like the grunge template for a lot of the music that I quite like now. I appeared onto my mind on music talking about kind of this genre called bubble grunge, which had like a mixture of pop and grunge music, and it has that kind of influence on it. Last night, the night before recording, I ended up on a strange, weird YouTube binge of songs that I loved, music I loved from 2008. Anyone on Twitter probably saw that, but a lot of the songs on that kind of had like a synthy sound, new wave-ish influence on them, and you can kind of hear that in this. So quite a lot of what I used to listen to in the late noughties was kind of influenced on this. So I feel like this was like revealing a bit of history of my taste. So like, yeah, so that's why I pretty much enjoyed that. But anyway, so if people want to find you or listen to your podcast, where can they find you?
All right, well, we are Playlist Wars. You can find us at playlistwarspodcast.com. There we have links to all of our episodes. The show's got a pretty easy format. There's myself, Alex Gomez, our co-host, and a special guest who we have on, and we each create a 10-song playlist about whatever the band, artist, or topic is, and then we discuss it track by track to kind of fight over who has the best playlist, and then we turn it over to our wonderful listeners to vote for which one of the three of us get right, and at the end of the season, we crown a quote-unquote winner. But the winner really is the discussions that we're having, all of us, at the end of the day, because we are celebrating all these bands and artists that we hold dear and love. We do have a fantastic episode on the Cars that I would hope that you guys go listen to. We are on Twitter. We are on Instagram. We are on Facebook. On Twitter, it is at Playlist Wars. Same thing with Facebook. On Instagram, it is at Playlist Wars Podcast. Gomez and I are on there. If you reach out to us, we will respond. We appreciate any support and connections. And Matt, we can't wait to have you come over the pond and come on an episode of Playlist Wars with us to battle over one of your favorite groups.
Okay. To be fair, I listened to it. I have started in my mind. I was like, it's an interesting exercise trying to get 10 tracks from like some of my favorite artists, which I might have already started doing actually. So I was, but yeah, I definitely want to take that invitation. But yeah, the Playlist Wars, I think, particularly, I've not listened to all of them. I purposely not listened to the Cars episode, purely because I kind of wanted to go in blank before. So pretty much, so I'll probably try and start. That's probably what I'm going to be listening to on the drive to work tomorrow, the Cars episode. But yeah, I feel you've hit a very good, interesting premise, which works very well. The I think yourself and Gomez have a nice dynamic, and the guests are quite interesting, and particularly I think as well it's similar to I think kind of the same mentality I have with this podcast, in that you pick guests that have a passion for the artist that they are picking, so you know you're going to get an enthusiastic guest talking about songs that they love and stuff. And it's I've said it on this podcast, said it on other podcasts, that I'll never find there is nothing. I always find people talking about things they love interesting, even if I'm not a fan of it. And I think Playlist Wars has that, particularly because everyone's passionate trying to fight their causes and stuff, including Christmas songs and movie references. And so,
yeah, we do sidebar and tangent a little bit, but we try to keep it all in place to what the songs we're talking about. I am a huge cover song fanatic. So anytime that I pick a tune and there's a cover about it, I like to mention it. And Gomez is the movie video game nerd of the pair. And anytime he could remember a reference when the song that he picked was in a movie, he's going to mention it. Even weird ones that you're like, you seriously saw that movie? And he's like, oh, of course, I got the DVD. Like, so as nerdy as I am about music, he is about music and video games, and it adds a nice dynamic.
Yeah, and I can't recommend Playlist Wars enough. So, and with that, Brian, it's same we have to say goodbye. So thank you ever so much for coming onto the podcast and introducing me to the cars.
Well, thank you for having me on. I love what you do here. You've introduced me to some albums that I probably would not have listened to prior. I love the discussion, and I do look forward to you coming on Playlist Wars in the future. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Pick a Disc, and I've been your host, Matthew Latham. Our theme music is Pump by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. Pick a Disc is hosted by the We Made This podcast network, and you can find them on www.spreaker.com/user/WeMadeThis. You can find the Pick a Disc show site on www.spreaker.com/show/pickadisc. You can find us on all the usual social media type places like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter under Pick a Disc. You can also email us on pickadisc@gmail.com. Until next time, happy listening to all those discs that you are picking. Goodbye.
Hello everyone, this is Tony, Network Chief of We Made This. As you know, our podcast network brings together a brilliant assortment of talent who talk about all kinds of pop culture content, such as the episode you've just listened to, or maybe you're just about to listen to. We're not going anywhere, but we'd love to keep the lights on for even longer if you're able to support our network on Patreon. For just £2 a month, you get your name in lights and the satisfaction of knowing you're helping us produce more great audio. And for £3 a month, you'll get your name in lights, but you'll also get access to an exclusive bi-monthly podcast from the We Made This talent pool on podcasting, pop culture, and, well, you tell us. We'll take your suggestions. For less than the price of a coffee per month, you can help keep We Made This going. Just head to patreon.com/We Made This. That's patreon.com/We Made This. And get the ball rolling. Now, back to your scheduled programming. Elsewhere on We Made This. The Movie Palace Podcast.
So I normally just ask people, Robert, their general thoughts on Alfred Hitchcock. Yeah, what are your thoughts and feelings about Hitchcock?
Well, it's funny because we had discussed, how this talk was going to go today, and I kept thinking, why have I been so interested in Hitchcock? Generally speaking, I'm more interested in the less technical filmmakers, and Hitchcock is such a technical filmmaker.
We dig music.
How come you always refer to Jonathan Donahue as Donahue and you always refer to PJ Harvey as Polly?
Because she's overly familiar with Polly. Right.
Yeah, that could do it.
It freaks me out as well. Like I don't call any of the singers in bands by their first name because I don't know them. I'm not like, oh, there's my mate Johannes from Cult of Luna. No. It's Johannes from Cult of Luna or Johannes Person. Or, oh my God, it's Johannes Person from Cult of Luna sometimes. Like, that's how I refer to him.
So you're saying that it's sit down Mr. Ulrich instead of sit down Lars?
I think it depends how much I take an artist to heart, and Polly is very, very dear to me. So.
Well, she thinks you're a prick because you don't like Ministry.
Shipwrecked and Comatose, a Red Dwarf podcast.
But you're not really quite sure what's happened there. It might put you off seeing the next one.
That does make a lot of sense, actually. Good point. All right.
Carl can always give us the information in a way we can make it understand. Me and Mark just go blah 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 blah.
I occasionally sound vaguely intelligent when I try very hard. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I occasionally
whine about gay shit. I'm multifaceted.
Okay. Anyway, moving on.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network.